Today I'm here to talk about environmental and genetic risk for perinatal depression. Pregnancy and the time after giving birth is known as the perinatal period, and this is a time when women can be more at risk for mental illnesses compared to other times in their lives. Perinatal depression affects 1 out of 10 women in Canada, and experiences of depression or anxiety during the perinatal period can lead to self-harm or suicidal ideation in the mothers, and they also make it difficult for the moms to emotionally attach to their child after giving birth. So it's important to understand what are some environmental or genetic risk factors for perinatal depression, so that we can identify women who may be more at risk for them early on and prevent it. In our lab, we looked at multiple environmental factors, including the age of the mother at delivery, socioeconomic status of the mother, stressful life events that the mother experienced up until the time of pregnancy, and history of sexual abuse before the age of 16 years old. And we also looked at some genetic risk factors for major depressive disorder, anxiety disorder, and bipolar disorder that may be associated with perinatal depression, to see if these factors could explain depressive symptoms in a cohort of moms from UK during the perinatal period. Looking at the environmental factors alone, history of sexual abuse, history of stressful life events, and crowding, which is the number of rooms that each person gets in a house that the moms are staying in. These variables were positively correlated with greater depressive symptoms in these moms during the perinatal period and at all of the perinatal period. And at the same time, the age of the mother at delivery and level of education of the moms were negatively correlated with depressive symptoms during the perinatal period. Using these 5 environmental factors, we were able to see that these variables predicted depressive symptoms from 10 to 20% in the moms during the perinatal period, and more so in the prenatal period, so during the pregnancy, compared to after giving birth. We also wanted to understand if there are any genetic or biological basis for perinatal depressive symptoms that overlap with other disorders that are associated with greater risk for perinatal depression. And these disorders are major depressive disorder, anxiety disorder, and bipolar disorder. Anxiety disorder is highly comorbid with perinatal depression, and bipolar disorder has been found to be have genetic alleles that overlap with greater risk for postpartum depression. So using genome-wide association studies that exist currently that were publicly available, we calculated genetic risk for these disorders, and then we correlated these genetic risks to the depressive symptoms of pregnant and perinatal moms and their depressive symptoms. And out of the multiple genetic risk scores, we found that the score that correlated at the highest level with perinatal depressive symptoms was a genetic risk for a depressive symptom GWAS that came from a depressive symptom GWAS multi-trait analysis from 2018 Turley et al. Paper. So after selecting for this genetic risk score, we added this score to the rest of the environmental factors to see if it would also increase the prediction of depressive symptoms during the perinatal period. The genetic risk score for the depressive symptoms correlated with history of sexual abuse, history of stressful life events, and crowding positively, and it correlated with age at delivery of the moms and level of education negatively. And as you can see from the second panel on this graph, that adding the genetic risk for depressive symptoms increased the prediction for depressive symptoms in the perinatal period. So based on this finding, we could conclude that the genetic basis for major depressive disorder or depressive symptoms had some overlap with genetic risk for perinatal depression. Out of the environmental factors that we were studying, there was one in particular that we were interested in, history of sexual abuse before the age of 16, because there have been studies that have shown that women who experienced history of sexual abuse and then went on to have depression afterwards may have a different subtype of depression compared to women who had no history of sexual abuse. So we wanted to see if this kind of finding is something we would also find in our own data. So we subdivided the women that we had into a group that had history of abuse and that did not have history of abuse. And we looked at the level of depressive symptoms. And we found that women who had history of sexual abuse had on average greater depressive symptoms compared to women who did not have history of sexual abuse. And we also found that using the environmental factors, the rest of the environmental factors to explain depressive symptoms in these moms, that we could explain the depressive symptoms of women with history of sexual abuse more than the women without history of sexual abuse. And this was true at all of the time points in the perinatal period. So regardless of whether this was during the pregnancy or after giving birth. However, something else that we found interesting is that when we just took the genetic risk score for depressive symptoms that was able to predict perinatal depression in moms regardless of sexual abuse status, we found that these genetic risk score were able to predict depression better in moms who had not been abused compared to moms who had been abused at 18 weeks into pregnancy. And this was not true at the other perinatal periods, at 32 weeks pregnancy or in the postpartum periods. And this was an interesting finding because we knew that depressive symptoms were already higher in women who had history of abuse at this time point compared to women who did not have history of sexual abuse. So it should have been the other way around, that it would explain better in the moms with abuse compared to moms without abuse. So we can interpret this finding to mean that at some time points in the perinatal period, that the history of sexual abuse, the effect of it on perinatal depression is so great that it masks the effect of the genetic predisposition for depressive symptoms on the moms, that regardless of what your genetic predisposition is if you have had history of sexual abuse, then you may be more likely to have depressive symptoms. And this is not true at all of the perinatal time points, but in this case, in our finding, at the very early stage of pregnancy. So lastly, I want to acknowledge my lab and the HBHL for allowing this research to happen. And thank you for this opportunity to present.